In this example, I have a web page that is kind of a black box, like it's not obvious what the page is going to do, but I have an input text field that has the default set to 250. And then what we're going to do is look at the HTML and JavaScript to figure out what's going to happen when we press the button. So this is the HTML file that I've put together for this, and we're going to go through it line by line and figure out what happens at each step. This is called tracing the code, kind of seeing what happens as you go through the code. The HTML begins here. We have a head, but the only thing the head has is a title that says example page. Real quick, let's go back and see what that does. If we go back to our page here, you can see that it says example page up in the tab. So that's one of the places that the title will appear. And the title ends, so we have the ending tag for the title, the ending tag for the head, and then the body begins here and it ends down here right before we end the HTML. What we saw was on our page there was a text box with a default value put in of 250. The way we create a text box is we do input type equals text. You have seen in previous examples where I put type equals text first and then I put the ID later. This is just scrambled to show you what you are able to do, which things can move around and which things can't without it getting confused. The text box is size 10, which think of it as being able to contain approximately 10 characters. Its ID is text box, so that's what we will use if we want to refer back to whatever is in the text box as a value at any point later on. And then it says value equals 250, and that's why when we loaded the web page, it said 250 already inside the text box. And then we saw that there was a button that just said press me. We have input type equals button, and again, the ID is before the type equals, so that's kind of the reverse of how I usually do it, but the order doesn't matter. The value is equal to press me, and that's what's going to display on the button. And then we have instructions on what we want to happen when we click, on click. When we click, we want to analyze what's going to happen here. So let's look first here. So this is our first statement, our first JavaScript statement inside of the quotes after the on click. And it says my var equals. So I'm creating a new variable called my var. And then I'm setting it equal to document.getElementById text box. So that means we'll go and look for the element which is the ID, which has an ID equal to text box, which is of course that text box at the top, dot value. So the variable will take whatever's in that text box with that ID and store the value. And I'm going to just type this here, but if you recall, the value in the text box is 250. But text boxes are always take an input as strings, not as integers. So it's going to be 250 in quotes, aka 250 read as a string. So that's important to keep in mind that it's reading that number, but it is reading that number as a string. Over here in the next line, so we've concluded that last line with a semicolon, meaning we're moving on to a new statement in JavaScript. What I do is I say my var equals my var plus 1. So I take whatever my var was equal to and I add 1 to it. So I'm going to write the output of this right next to this JavaScript statement just temporarily. Okay, here's what the output will look like. So my var is my var plus 1. So my var is going to now be equal to 250, which is a string, plus 1. So the output here is 250 concatenated with 1, so 2501. It is not 251, even though that is normally how you would think addition works if you're adding 250 and 1. But again, 250 is not looked at as a numerical value in this case because it was read in as a string. Instead of deleting this, I'm sticking 2 slashes in front of it. These 2 slashes make something into a comment, which means it exists in your source code, something that the programmer can read, but it's not going to show up at all on your web page. So by making this to a comment, I haven't changed at all what the program is doing. I have just provided this information so that we can keep track of what's happening at every step. To that end, I'm going to put a comment on the previous line providing what my var is equal to as well. So on the previous line, my var was equal to 250 as a string. The next line is very similar. My var equals my var plus 2. So my var now is equal to 2501. And then if I add 2 to that, what happens is the same thing where we get string concatenation instead of addition. The result of this addition is 25012. So all the numbers just get concatenated together like that. So now my var is 25012 as a string. And then this third statement I have is my var equals my var plus 3, but that's behind a double slash. So that means it's a comment, it's not part of the code, and it's not going to change the output. So we can ignore that line when looking at what is going to happen when we click that button. Then the last thing that happens when we click the button is this line down here, document.getElementById div1 .innerHTML equals my var. In order to figure out what's going to happen, we first have to identify what element on this page has the ID div1, and that element is right here below that statement. We have div ID equals div1. There's nothing in it, and then we end the div tag. And then it says .innerHTML. So innerHTML is just whatever exists between the starting tag and the ending tag. And right now it's nothing, but we're going to set it equal to my var. So my var we know is 25012. What this tells us is that when we push that button in this div tag, which is below the button, we're going to see as output 25012. Just to check that our conclusion is correct, we'll go back to the web page right here. We'll press the button that says press me, and you can see that it output 25012. One thing to notice here is that when I was writing the value, I had quotes around that 25012, and I needed to so that it could show that this was a string and not a number. But when a string is output as innerHTML, the quotes won't be rendered into the output. So you can see here it's just 25012 without the quotes around it. That is what will happen when we click the button in this specific example.